For the first of a new series looking at the stories behind notable court cases from history. This week, the trial of William Joyce, Lord Haw Haw, who had alternately alarmed and entertained the British public during World War II with his propaganda broadcasts from Germany. After the war, he was captured and put in the dock. But what was his crime? Clive Anderson examines the trial of William Joyce in Every Case Tells the Story.
Mother gets quite angry if I dare to tune in anything outside the home service. I say, while she's out of the room, let's see if Lord Haw Haw's still on the air. You don't hear so much about him nowadays.
This evening, I am talking to you about Germany.
William Joyce, Nazi Germany's English-language radio star and propagandist, stayed loyal to Adolf Hitler right to the end.
Let me tell you that in Germany, there still remains the spirit of unity and the spirit of strength.
That was his very last broadcast, 30th of April 1945, the very day that Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin. William Joyce, Lord Haw Haw, as he was called by everyone in his English-speaking audience, had been broadcasting to Britain in his distinctive, sneery, pompous voice since the very beginning of the war. But it must have taken a special type of persistence to be still at it right at the very end, right at the death.
I have always hoped and believed that in the last resort there would be an alliance, a combine, an understanding between England and Germany. Well, at the moment, that seems impossible. Good. If it cannot be, then I can only say that the whole of my work has been in vain.
Perhaps he can be forgiven for being so obviously drunk in charge of his last words on air. Winston Churchill was known to have taken a drink or two before making some of his most famous speeches. Things were different in broadcasting in those days. But by then it must have been obvious to Haw Haw that the whole of his work had been in vain. Haw Haw had lost out to war. After his last broadcast he fled, only to be captured near the Danish border 4 weeks later. So, nearly 6 years after leaving the United Kingdom, but calling from Germany, broadcasting his way into the collective imagination and the collective fears of the British nation at war, William Joyce was on his way back to Blighty, in custody, to stand trial for high treason, facing, as he must have realised, the prospect of the death penalty. Colin Holmes is Emeritus Professor of History at Sheffield University and author of a new book about William Joyce.
There is, in fact, a report from an American official in Berlin saying that Joyce has been known to say that if the war goes badly, he will be all right because he's got an American birth certificate. So if you read Commander Burt's report, he brings Joyce back to Britain to face trial, with 3 armed guards on the plane, by the way. And he said that, in fact, Joyce was coolly reconciled to being hanged. No, he wasn't. Because how can the British hang an American for treason?
Well, how could the British hang an American for treason? That was to be the central issue when on the 17th of September 1945, William Joyce stood in the dock at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, one of the most hated men in the country, on trial for his life. There were plenty of broadcasts on which to base the case against him, but were we so determined to obtain a conviction that all other considerations, legal logic, fairness, justice even, were put to one side?
I think it was sheer vengeance. I mean, this was the Labour government which had taken over. It was representing the men who'd been killed, their families. Joyce was the most obvious symbol of Nazism. Unlike Hitler, he was in our grasp.
Geoffrey Robertson, QC, is a prominent human rights lawyer who has appeared in court cases in the United Kingdom and all around the world, very often dealing with the justice meted out after wars and major conflicts have come to an end. Emotions often run high in such cases, and they certainly did in the case of William Joyce, Lord Haw Haw. But first of all, who was he? What kind of traitor was he? A fake? A fanatic? An Englishman? An Irishman? an American? Well, it seems all of the above.
What we have here is a birth certificate for William Joyce issued by the state of New York. It says that he's born on the 24th of April 1906 at 1377 Herkimer Street. That's in Brooklyn. His father is Michael Joyce and his mother is Gertrude Emily Joyce. And that is signed by Charles Yerden, who is a physician, in May 1906.
William Joyce was an American born in Brooklyn, New York, to an Irish father and an English mother. But 3 years later, the family moved back to his father's birthplace of County Mayo on the west coast of Ireland. So, born in America but raised in Ireland, which until 1922 was part of the United Kingdom. They were a middle-class family. Joyce's father was a landlord and businessman, and they were extremely pro-British at a time when Irish nationalism was just achieving its aim. So much so that by the time William Joyce was a teenager, the future mouthpiece of Britain's enemy was active in the service of the British state, working as an informer for British troops. He was only 15 years old, but does that give us a clue as to the character of the man he was becoming? Colin Holmes.
There is a plan by the IRA to shoot him, 1921, in December. That plan failed because Michael Joyce had actually moved him on that particular day to another safer house in Galway, so he didn't take his normal way back from school. But by this time, Joyce was actually closely associated with Captain Keating, who was working for British Army intelligence in Ireland. And Keating had some conscience, I think, about employing him because he was mustered into the Worcester Regiment. And so he does go to England at a very early age, on his own, 1921, first of all with the military, then he's discharged from the military, and he attends military school in Aldershot, and then very quickly he starts moving into other areas of education.
So William Joyce had evidently felt deep allegiances to Britain. But by the time he was in the dock, he looked more like a pantomime villain. A deep scar stretched from his mouth all across his right cheek, the result, he said, of an attack by Jewish communists when he was stewarding a Conservative Party meeting in Lambeth in 1924. But he was certainly no mere thug or street fighter, rather a man of some intellect with high aspirations for himself in the world of politics.
He'd been very badly burnt by what he saw as the betrayal of his pro-British family in Ireland. And he believed that fascism, which argued for a strong empire, dominated from the metropolitan core, would in fact overcome this problem. Fascism emphasised the importance in society of what's called the technocratic elite, an elite group that would in fact dominate and rule society. This appealed to Joyce. He sniffed the prospect of an important role here for him. But interacting with these two forces was in fact Joyce's personality. He had a Manichaean view of the world. The world had to be divided into black and white. As simple as that, as brutal as that.
William Joyce was American, but he lied on a form in order to obtain a British passport. Whether getting hold of this dodgy document made him British enough to be hanged for treason was the main issue in the case. But the trial judge, Mr. Justice Tucker, directed the jury that as a matter of law he was British enough, and they need not concern themselves with this aspect of the case. Why did the judge withdraw this issue from the jury?
Well, the prejudice was such that they may well have convicted if he'd left the issue to them to decide.
Yeah.
But he wasn't going to take that risk.
Brother black shirts, my comrades in struggle. Our fight is for the soul of Britain, and in that battle we go forward together till victory be won.
In 1934, William Joyce had become the director of propaganda for Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, Mosley's Goebbels in a sense. He was charismatic, and he could talk and argue and use his fists when he needed to. He honed his skills as an orator, making fiery speeches in drafty halls. But he and Mosley were never close, and 3 years later, William Joyce was cut loose from the BUF.
By 1939, he'd given up any hope that a British fascist movement would actually achieve that root and branch transformation of society he believed was needed, that clearing out of the old guard. They had to be got rid of. His one remaining hope was that the only people who would do it were the architects of the already constructed concentration camps.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note.
What he believed was that Britain needed a period under stern Nazi tutelage if it were to recover as a major power.
And that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain using the wireless to announce the beginning of hostilities on the 3rd of September 1939. On that very day, officers arrived at William Joyce's flat in London to arrest him under defence regulations, which, now that war had begun, allowed the imprisonment of hardcore Nazi sympathisers. But Joyce had left for Germany a couple of days earlier. He was rallying to the Nazi cause in Germany, equipped with his falsely obtained British passport and his somewhat false-sounding British upper-class accent.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling.
Professor Gene Seaton is a historian of broadcasting.
He becomes a star. I mean, he gets to be the best paid star of German broadcasting.
To say that the British Empire is in danger today would be a very feeble understatement.
Early on in the war, he believes that he's going to be welcomed back to Britain as a great hero who's led Britain to proper fascism alongside Germany in the remade, Reich world. He can't have believed that by the end, but by the end he's burnt all of his boats.
Far from the conquering hero, back in Britain, Joyce is sitting in the dock of the Bailey, facing a trial that could end his days. An early example of someone who'd used broadcasting as a weapon of war, which was to become more and more important in conflicts in subsequent decades.
There's still a live issue today about the role of propaganda stations. I mean, the Americans, the British had a big punch-up over Serbia, and whether station, I think the Americans bombed it in the end against British reservations and killed 16 journalists because they said it was one of Milosevic's propaganda stations. On the other hand, in the international court in Rwanda, Radio Mille Colline, which broadcast incitements to genocide, the grave is only half full, who will help us fill it? Those Lord Haw Haws in Rwanda during the genocide were jailed for 20 years.
Yes.
Now, I think looking at Joyce's rather pathetic, ludicrous broadcast today, we might not even put him in that category.
Lord Haw Haw, the humbug of Hamburg, the bloke with the tonsils and tone.
Well, Joyce's broadcasts do sound ludicrous to modern ears here in the safety of the post-war world. His boasts and his manner of delivery were always something of a joke, even when battles were raging. But merely a figure of fun? That's not something Colin Holmes agrees with.
I think that's a myth, one of the many myths that surround Joyce. I would ask you to listen to the broadcast that Joyce gave in June 1940 after the fall of France.
That it is impossible for Mr. Churchill and his military subordinates to plead that surprise alone accounts for their discomfiture and the peril to which they have exposed luckless England. Surprised, of course, they may well be by the new methods of fighting and the terrible weapons, mysterious weapons, which Germany has evolved. There are more surprises of an unpleasant nature to come.
The Nazis had actually sighed through Western Europe in about 37 days. A swastika flag was flying above the Eiffel Tower. Britain was standing out alone in Western Europe.
The Führer is not fond of threatening.
And here is Joyce broadcasting.
He prefers action. There is only one probability with which Britain has to reckon, and that is surprise.
Between about 25th and 28th of May 1940, the War Cabinet under Churchill, there was actually discussion as to whether the country should in fact conclude a peace treaty with Hitler. And this idea that Joyce is simply a good laugh, it's simply one of those myths that Britain can take it. We're different. People felt threatened.
Opportunities of peace were present until it was clear that they would never be taken. And that is why we had recourse to the arbitrament of the sword of a Europe reborn. That is the end of our news and talk.
Shortly after this, on the 26th of September 1940, William Joyce became a German citizen. From the start of his broadcast until that point, he'd been in possession of that British passport. If he'd made the effort to apply for an American passport, instead of telling a fib on a form in order to get a British one, which probably seemed much easier at the time, it could very well have saved his life. On such small matters can turn great cases, causes and battles, and a man's life.
The prosecution said that Joyce had a British passport. In fact, he'd applied for a British passport not once, not twice, but 3 times, in 1933, 38 and 39. And on each occasion, he'd said that he was actually British. And that last passport was issued in August 1939, and it lasted for 1 year.
Could you characterise this as sort of a show trial, a way of exacting punishment on somebody, and the somebody was this person whose voice had become pretty familiar to the British people in a very dark time?
I mean, well, you say dark. 60% of radio listeners, after listening to the BBC News, which was propagandistic in its own way,
yes,
would turn on to Joyce to hear the other side of the story.
There is still no indication that the British people are fully or even imperfectly informed as to the facts of the military situation. To judge by the BBC bulletins, they have no idea where the front is.
The BBC, the Ministry of Information, the government all get extremely anxious that the British public are listening to this man. And then they do this wonderful thing, which is very new then. They do audience research. The BBC in particular, but public bodies all over, suddenly turn around to the British public because they really, really, really need to know what the British public is thinking. And the results of that is that it's proved that he isn't doing that much damage to British morale. It's also proved that actually the British would have found the banning of access to him would make him look as if he was saying something that really mattered. And thirdly, actually in principle it would have been the wrong thing to do. So Lord Haw Haw leads to a reinforcement in practice, in the direst of circumstances, a wonderful version of John Stuart Mill, in which, you let you hear the argument. All arguments should be tested. Whereas, of course, the Germans were banning British broadcasts. I have a colleague, actually, whose first job was in the Austrian archive, finding and itemising the number of people, just in Austria, who had been shot for listening to the BBC. But you don't get shot for listening to Haw Haw.
If I am right, then I can only say that the people of Britain deserve what they get in the future.
That final drunken broadcast was made on April the 30th, 1945. 4 weeks later, out walking in woods near the Danish border, he came upon 2 British officers collecting firewood.
When he saw what we were doing, he pointed with his walking stick to some logs and spoke to us in French. And then, in English, he said, "Oh, there are 3 or 4 more here." When I turned to Licorice, he said to me, that sounded terribly like William Joyce. And then he picked up a log with both hands, put it into the truck, and before he had an opportunity to put his hand back in his pocket, I challenged him and said, "You wouldn't be William Joyce by any chance, would you?" And his hand dropped back to his pocket. I thought he was going for his gun. I drew my own pistol, aimed low, and fired.
So they've got their man. And I think Joyce probably had a good idea that the British would take a very strong line with him. If I've got to pick up the bill, he said, then I'll pick it up. But you see, he had a card to play, didn't he? Because he's got his American birth certificate.
And he doesn't have to wait long to play that card. In fact, he doesn't have to wait long for anything. To modern legal eyes, everything proceeds at a breakneck pace. Joyce was apprehended in Germany on the 28th of May, and just 3.5 months later, his trial is underway in London. No suffering the law's delays, at any rate. But the whole trial only lasted 3 days. The case with you in it, Geoffrey, I should think you would expect that to last about 3 months, wouldn't you?
It would last a few weeks.
Yeah.
But, you see, the issue is, to what extent does an alien, and Joyce was an American, owe allegiance to the British Crown so that if he helps the enemy, he can be executed for treason? Of course, an alien owes allegiance when he's in Britain, But Joyce, when he made these broadcasts, was an American living in Germany. So how could they get him? In effect, they couldn't, but they managed to, of course, because they found that he'd applied for a British passport, lying on the form, on the application form, that he was British. Now, the serious crime in those days of making a false statement on your passport application involved a sentence of £2 maximum fine.
Well, Joyce was not on trial for making a false declaration on a passport application. He was on trial for broadcasting Nazi propaganda during wartime. He sounded British. Apart from the war, he'd lived in the UK for all but the first 3 years of his life. He'd identified with Britain. But in all the circumstances, did the Central Criminal Court have the jurisdiction to try him if he was an alien able to side with anyone he liked?
The prosecution has 3 charges against him. First of all, they say that he was charged with treason because he broadcast to the enemy between the 18th of September 1939 and the 29th of May 1945, in other words, throughout the length of the war, basically.
Well, he could only be guilty of this if he was and remained British throughout the war.
Secondly, they accused him of treason for assuming German nationality during the war.
Switching to an enemy nationality in time of war is another way of committing treason, but not if you're not British in the first place.
And the third charge was that he broadcast to the enemy between the 18th of September 1939 and the 2nd of July 1940.
That is, until his, albeit falsely obtained, passport ran out.
Now, when Joyce produced his American birth certificate, the first 2 charges had to be dropped from the indictment, but still left the third charge, that he broadcast to the enemy between the 18th of September 1939 and the 2nd of July 1940, worked for the Nazis while he still held a British passport.
Clive, you've got to remember, in those days, they didn't have dual nationality. You were a national of the country where you were born, and he was an American living in Britain, but then when he made these broadcasts, he was an American living in Germany.
Sir Hartley Shawcross, the Attorney General, argued that if an alien clothes himself in the Union Jack, he owes an allegiance to the Crown, wherever he may be. The passport gave him protection. Joyce owed it a corresponding allegiance. Mr. Justice Tucker agreed with the prosecution's argument, and when Tucker pronounced on that, Joyce's fate was effectively sealed. And so when the jury retired at 3:37 in the afternoon on the 19th of September 1945, they reached their verdict of guilty in 23 minutes.
William Joyce was duly sentenced to death. Now, had he received a death sentence in his native America, he might have spent years and years on death row while legal issues were argued and due process followed. But that's not how it was done in England in 1945.
They didn't waste any time executing him, and that is one of the particular disgraces of this wretched proceeding, that they executed him before the judgments were delivered.
Joyce's appeal was rejected by the Court of Criminal Appeal on the 1st of November, and rejected again by the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords, the equivalent of our modern-day Supreme Court, on the 13th of December.
The judges came in, and they were a pretty lick-spittle lot, and they said, oh, we're inclined to disallow his appeal. And they just said a few words, and Lord Porter, actually the only one of the judges who had any idea of the criminal law, said that he was a bit troubled. But they didn't bother about waiting for his troubles to be set out in a judgment. They took that as the disallowance of the appeal, and they rushed Joyce to the gallows.
William Joyce was hanged little more than 2 weeks later on the 3rd of January 1946. He died without even seeing the written reasons the law lords eventually gave for their decision, which were only published after his death. He was 39 years old. So was he just one more casualty of war, or a traitor unlucky enough to be caught out by relying on the false protection of his American birth certificate, like Macbeth relying on the witch's promises, or just a scapegoat? Jean Seaton.
The British public wants a symbolic revenge. This is the same British public who puts up with bread rationing after the end of the Second World War in order that food is redistributed into Germany. to ensure that Germans are in the end protected from starvation in those first 2 years. So that symbolic retribution has also to be put into a context of a wider magnanimity.
I think it was seen very much as a symbolic act of revenge by a new government, and they wanted to show toughness. And they did. It's one of those regrettable episodes. I'd list it with Stephen Ward, perhaps the Birmingham Six.
Yes.
British justice has gone terribly wrong on a number of occasions.
Geoffrey Robertson sees William Joyce as the victim of an historic miscarriage of justice. I don't think most people will put it quite like that, dispiriting though it is to see the legal system bent on getting a conviction at all costs, and judges lacking proper judgment under pressure. Hanging a man for making a series of radio broadcasts, however provocative, seems excessive today, but no doubt seemed rather less so at the end of a world war in which millions had died, largely for being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
I would only say that the men who have died in the Battle of Berlin have given their lives to show that whatever else happens, Germany will live.
William Joyce, the Anglo-Irish American, used the wrong form to get the wrong passport and joined the wrong side, even though he went to his grave still believing in the rightness of the Nazi cause. For a few years he was Lord Haw Haw, the voice of a nation speaking war unto nation. He gave his life attempting to sap the will of the British people, and even that earned him nothing but ridicule.
Germany will live because the people of Germany have in them the secret of life.
The long-term evidence, of course, is that Haw Haw was astonishingly unsuccessful. There was not a single German spy in Britain who the government didn't know about. There were periods of intense and very frightening disorder after the bombings in Southampton, after the bombings in Coventry. The myth of solidarity and British people pulling together under those circumstances was very much shown not to be true. So there's lots of things myth-making about the Second World War. But on any empirical standards, he was 100% unsuccessful. He didn't persuade anybody.
You may not hear from me again for a few months. I say, es lebe Deutschland. Heil Hitler, and farewell.
Every Case Tells a Story was presented by Clive Anderson. The producer was Martin Williams.